Welcome, chosen one. At some point, you have to stop pretending that nothing changed. You felt it before anyone had the courage to say it. The energy shifted. Conversations became shorter. The laughter around you became more careful. The room that once ignored your presence suddenly started noticing every word you said. People who used to interrupt you now wait for you to finish. Those who once overlooked you are watching closely. That is not coincidence. That is recognition finally arriving after years of being delayed. Think back to the beginning. They told you to calm down. They told you that you were imagining things. They told you to stay in your lane and accept the position they had assigned to you. They laughed because mocking something is easier than admitting it might become powerful. They underestimated you because underestimation allowed them to feel safe. But look at what is happening now. The same people who once dismissed your vision are suddenly asking questions. The same people who never cared about your plans now want updates. The same people who laughed at your confidence are quietly studying your progress. You kept moving when nobody was clapping. You continued when support disappeared. You stayed committed when the results were nowhere in sight. They expected exhaustion to defeat you, but every setback taught you something. They expected rejection to make you quit, but rejection made you sharper. They expected the lack of support to close the door, yet somehow another door kept appearing. What they called a temporary phase became a transformation they could no longer ignore. And here is where the story becomes interesting. Someone noticed before the others did. Someone who wasn't distracted by appearances. Someone who understood patterns, patience, discipline, and pressure. While everyone else was watching the surface, this person was paying attention to what was happening underneath. They saw what you were becoming before the evidence became obvious. When uncertainty began spreading behind closed doors, they asked this person to intervene. They wanted someone to approach you. They wanted someone to slow you down. They wanted someone to convince you that you were moving too fast or dreaming too big. They called it concern. They made it sound like they were protecting you from making a mistake. But real concern doesn't panic when someone succeeds. Real concern doesn't desperately search for a way to stop momentum. They said, please talk to them, tell them what is coming. Maybe they will listen to you. And the person they trusted didn't react with fear. He didn't rush to you with warnings. He didn't make promises. He simply smiled because he had already understood what they were too late to recognize. It wasn't a smile of arrogance. It was the expression of someone who had already connected the dots. Someone who understood that certain moments cannot be reversed. When they asked if there was still a way to stop what was happening, the answer was simple. Too late, 2 words, but they carried more weight than a long explanation ever could. Because sometimes too late isn't a threat, it is simply the truth. Pause for a moment and recognize something important. This did not happen overnight. The version of you they are noticing today was built quietly. It was created during the seasons when nobody was watching. You learned how to listen without revealing everything. You learned how to observe without reacting. You watched people expose themselves simply because they couldn't control what they said. You experienced losses that could have destroyed you, but instead they taught you how to rebuild differently. Most people become discouraged when their plans fail. You learn to adjust. Most people need constant validation to continue. You learn to move without applause. Most people panic when they lose control. You learned to remain steady inside uncertainty. That difference is powerful because endurance can eventually outperform raw talent. They aren't intimidated by your loudness, they are unsettled by your silence. They don't understand why you no longer feel the need to explain every decision. They don't understand why you stopped asking for permission. They don't understand how you can face uncertainty without immediately running back to what is familiar. You move with the mindset of someone who has already survived the outcome they feared most. That is difficult to control. A person who is no longer terrified of losing approval becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. A person who has learned from failure becomes harder to discourage. A person who has discovered their own direction no longer needs everyone else to validate the path. That is why your transformation feels threatening to people who were comfortable with the old version of you. Look at how history works. Major changes rarely begin with applause. They begin with someone being underestimated. Someone gets overlooked. Someone gets mocked. Someone gets told that their vision is unrealistic. Then they continue anyway. Eventually, the conversation changes. The people who once laughed start saying, "Maybe we should have listened." The people who dismissed the possibility start asking, "How did we not see this coming?" They weren't studying the right things. They were measuring popularity instead of persistence. They were counting attention instead of discipline. They were looking at your current position instead of the pressure you had already survived. They were judging the chapter while you were preparing the entire story. And that is the part they struggle to understand. Your greatest advantage was never noise. It was consistency. The moment they sent someone to warn you was actually the moment they revealed how seriously they viewed your momentum. People who feel completely secure don't panic. They don't send messengers. They don't suddenly become interested in slowing someone down. Fear creates conversations behind closed doors. Fear creates questions. Fear creates attempts to predict what happens next. But you had already stopped living according to their expectations. You don't need them to understand you anymore. You don't need them to agree with you. You don't need them to recognize your value before you recognize it yourself. That is why the dynamic has changed. Their opinion used to feel like a verdict. Now it feels like background noise. You are entering the aftermath of everything you survived. The storm has already taught you what it came to teach. What remains is the strange quiet afterward. The silence where people pretend everything is normal while privately changing how they approach you. Invitations feel different. Conversations feel more calculated. Resistance feels weaker. Criticism sounds less confident, and you can sense the difference because you have learned to notice what isn't being said. You are not imagining the shift, but don't become distracted by it either. The greatest mistake you could make now is becoming obsessed with who is watching. Let them watch. Let them wonder. Let them question. Your responsibility is not to prove them wrong. Your responsibility is to remain faithful to the path you have chosen. They wanted you uncertain. You became clear. They expected you to chase approval. You learned to trust your own direction. They expected you to react emotionally. You learned to respond with wisdom. They wanted control over the version of you they understood, but you became someone they could no longer define. That is why the warning came too late. You had already crossed the line between surviving and becoming. You had already outgrown the environment that once convinced you to stay small. You had already learned the lessons they thought would break you. No conversation can return you to the mindset you have already outgrown. This isn't about becoming someone else. It is about finally recognizing who you became through everything you endured. The person they are trying to catch up with was built in silence. The confidence they are noticing was built through uncertainty. The discipline they are witnessing was built through disappointment. The calm they find confusing was earned through battles they never saw. So stay steady, chosen one. Don't become distracted by sudden attention. Don't let unexpected recognition change your character. Don't rush to explain what time is already revealing. Let your actions continue speaking. Let your consistency finish the sentence. And let the people who underestimated you watch from a distance as the story continues without their permission. Because sometimes the most powerful answer isn't an argument, a confrontation, or a dramatic comeback. Sometimes the answer is simply continuing forward until the people who doubted you realize they are no longer part of the decision. And now the real chapter begins. What comes next isn't empty motivation. It is the deeper breakdown of how pressure creates strength, how silence becomes strategy, and how the person everyone underestimated eventually becomes the person nobody can afford to ignore. So stay with me, chosen one. Because if you think the shift was powerful, you haven't seen what happens after everyone finally realizes they were too late. If you're still here, there's probably a reason. Something about this message feels strangely familiar, almost as if it is describing a chapter you have already lived through, so stay intentional. Hit like and subscribe, not simply as a favor, but as a way of supporting a message that may reach someone who needs it. This isn't about numbers. It's about keeping a powerful reminder moving forward. And if you have made it this far, pay close attention because the next part goes deeper. If you are truly ready for what comes next, you may already feel that pull. Not excitement exactly, but a sense that you need to keep listening. The kind of feeling that tells you there is something unfinished here. This next chapter breaks down how people can underestimate someone for years only to realize that the person they ignored has quietly become impossible to stop. Drop 777 in the comments if you're ready to continue. Not because a number has magical power, but because it can represent your willingness to keep moving through seasons of silence, isolation, and doubt. What once felt like punishment may have actually been preparation. The moments when nobody understood you may have been the moments that strengthened you the most. Take a breath, because the warm-up is over. Now we go deeper. Number 1, when the warning suddenly arrives wrapped in kindness, pay attention to what changed. People rarely send someone to slow down a person they believe they can still control. A messenger usually appears when direct influence has become uncertain. When plans begin falling apart and predictions stop matching reality. People often look for someone who can approach the situation gently and make hesitation sound like wisdom. Ask yourself why the concern appeared now. Why wasn't anyone warning you when you were struggling? Where were they when you were isolated, uncertain, and trying to hold everything together? When you were going through the hardest chapters, many people simply watched. Some doubted you. Some expected you to give up. Some quietly believed that your difficult season would prevent you from ever becoming a threat to their expectations. They made one major mistake. They confused your silence with defeat. But your silence was observation. While they were talking, you were learning. While they were revealing their habits, you were recognizing patterns. They made another mistake when they confused your patience with weakness. You weren't standing still, you were learning timing. And when you stepped away from the noise, they assumed you had surrendered. In reality, you were creating space to rebuild without distraction. You didn't disappear, you reset. Every time they thought you had reached the end, you were making adjustments. Every setback taught you how to move differently. Every disappointment forced you to become more disciplined. While others measured success through attention, praise, and approval, you began measuring it through endurance. You learned how to continue even when nobody was encouraging you. That kind of transformation is difficult to predict because it happens quietly. Now the atmosphere feels different. Conversations may seem more careful. Compliments can sound measured. Criticism may arrive disguised as friendly advice. People who once ignored your decisions suddenly seem interested in what you are doing next. Don't become obsessed with their attention, but recognize what it reveals. Something about your position has changed. When someone needs another person to approach you because they don't feel comfortable addressing you directly, that says something. They may present it as advice. They may call it concern. They may say they only want what is best for you. But sometimes what they really want is more time to understand a situation they no longer control. And notice who they choose as the messenger. Often it isn't the most aggressive person in the room. It is the person you already trust. The calm voice, the familiar face, the person capable of making hesitation sound reasonable. They hope familiarity will accomplish what authority could not, but you already sensed something was different. There is a moment when you realize that the conversation isn't really about protecting you. It's about understanding why you are no longer responding the way you used to. And instead of reacting with anger, you become calm. You recognize the situation for what it is. You understand that if someone suddenly needs to warn you after ignoring you for so long, the window they are worried about may already have closed. Behind the scenes, questions begin appearing. When did this happen? How did they become this disciplined? Why didn't pressure destroy them? Why didn't rejection make them quit? Why did they become stronger instead of bitter? Those questions can be uncomfortable because the answers require admitting that your transformation was earned. It is easier for people to call your progress luck than to admit that you developed strength under circumstances that would have discouraged them. Think about the pattern. First comes ridicule, then dismissal, then distance, then silence. Then, when the underestimated person continues progressing, the atmosphere changes. Suddenly there is curiosity, then concern, then warnings. That warning stage is important because it often reveals that confidence has started turning into uncertainty. And here is what you need to understand. If people are suddenly warning you now, don't automatically assume you need to turn around. You have already learned what happens when you allow people who never walked your path to make decisions for your future. You know what it costs to constantly doubt yourself just to keep other people comfortable. That chapter can be over. They may not actually be afraid of what you will do to them. They may be uncomfortable with what your growth represents. Your progress challenges the idea that approval is required for success. Your endurance challenges the belief that pressure always destroys people. Your independence proves that someone can lose support, lose comfort, lose certainty, and still continue forward. So when someone says, "We're only concerned about you," listen carefully. But don't automatically surrender your judgment. When they say, "Maybe you should slow down," ask yourself whether the advice is genuinely wise or simply convenient for them. When they say, "This could end badly," remember that fear can sometimes disguise itself as concern. But don't become arrogant either. Discernment means listening without becoming controlled by what you hear. Wisdom means considering advice without surrendering your direction. You don't need to fight everyone who doubts you. Sometimes the strongest response is simply continuing with clarity. And the most powerful part is that you didn't have to destroy anyone to reach this point. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to prove a point every day. You simply refused to collapse. You chose growth over validation. You stayed consistent when inconsistency would have been easier. You kept moving while other people waited for you to quit. That's why the smile matters. Not because of arrogance, but because of recognition. Recognition that some seasons cannot be reversed. You cannot frighten someone who has already survived their deepest uncertainty. You cannot easily control someone who has learned to stand alone. And you cannot force someone backward after they have finally discovered their direction. The people who came with warnings may not have been coming to rescue you. They may have been coming because they were trying to understand what happens next, and the realization that they were late may not have happened with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it happens in silence. The moment someone realizes they are no longer ahead of the situation, they are behind it. This isn't about revenge, it's about position. You are no longer constantly reacting to what everyone else does. You are becoming more intentional about where you place your energy, your attention, and your time. And once you reach that point, other people's warnings lose the power they once had. Maybe they should have listened earlier. Maybe they should have paid attention when the signs were smaller. Maybe they should have respected your silence instead of interpreting it as weakness. But hindsight doesn't change the path that brought you here. All they can do now is look backward and wonder what they missed. You don't have to. You've already moved forward. Number 2, the room became quiet because the old dynamic was disappearing. Fear usually needs a room full of people to convince itself that everything is still under control. Confidence doesn't need a meeting. Picture the scene. Closed doors, phones turned over, voices lowered. Everyone pretending that privacy can somehow protect them from reality. They might call it a strategy session, a routine discussion, or a simple check-in. But beneath the polished language was something much simpler: uncertainty. They were trying to sound organized while quietly wondering how things had reached this point. Phrases like, "We still have time," and "Let's handle this carefully," probably sounded reassuring on the surface, but underneath those words was the thought nobody wanted to say. "We didn't expect them to get this far." Someone mentioned your name cautiously. Someone else admitted that the situation was becoming difficult to manage. Another person tried to convince everyone that you were still predictable, still reachable, still someone they could influence. That's usually how denial sounds when it begins losing its grip. People convince themselves that a situation is manageable right before realizing it has already moved beyond their control. Imagine ignoring a small crack in a wall for years and then suddenly discovering that the entire foundation has shifted. Instead of addressing the foundation, everyone starts discussing how to make the crack less noticeable. That's what happens when people focus on appearances instead of reality. They call it concern, intervention, or protection, but the real issue is much deeper. They weren't necessarily worried about you losing control. They were worried about themselves losing influence over the situation. And then there was one person in the room who wasn't reacting like everyone else. He wasn't rushing to create a solution. He wasn't making dramatic statements. He was simply observing. He watched who spoke first, who became defensive, who avoided certain questions, and who suddenly sounded less confident than before. Experience teaches you something important. When people feel their influence slipping, the room usually gets louder, more explanations appear, more strategies are proposed. More people try to convince themselves that everything can still be fixed. But noise doesn't restore control, it only reveals uncertainty. He understood what the others didn't want to admit. You cannot stop momentum simply by talking about it. You cannot reverse someone's growth because it makes you uncomfortable. And you cannot regain influence by disguising fear as advice. Eventually, someone suggested that they should contact you. Not necessarily because they suddenly understood you, but because they hoped familiarity could accomplish what authority no longer could. They needed someone who could approach you without immediately creating resistance. Someone who could make hesitation sound reasonable. Someone who could introduce doubt without making it obvious. That's when the room changed. The person they were looking at had seen this pattern before. Different circumstances, different people, but the same behavior. A group realizes that the story they once controlled is moving beyond them. Influence doesn't always disappear with a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it simply slips away while everyone is still talking. He understood one simple truth: you don't negotiate with momentum. You don't stop a person who has already crossed the internal threshold. And you don't become afraid of something you still believe you can control. Fear begins when you realize control has already disappeared. When they asked him to step in, his response wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was calm. He didn't need a long explanation. Too late. Those two words changed the atmosphere. Imagine a completely silent room when something suddenly breaks. Everyone freezes because the sound confirms what they were trying not to acknowledge. That's what those words represented. Someone tried to laugh it off, hoping the tension would disappear. But the message was already clear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend his conclusion. He didn't need to. Too late wasn't a threat. It was a statement about timing. At that moment, the people in that room were forced to confront what they had avoided. This was no longer about preventing something from happening. It was about watching the consequences of their earlier decisions unfold. Their plan wasn't suddenly failing. It had been failing for much longer than they realized. They were simply becoming aware of it. That's what panic does. It sends people backward through time. Suddenly, everyone starts remembering the moments they ignored. We should have paid attention. We should have taken them seriously. We thought pressure would make them quit. We assumed silence meant weakness. We believed they would eventually return to the old version of themselves. But regret doesn't reverse momentum. And this is where many people misunderstand your story. They ask why nobody acted earlier. Why didn't they help when you were struggling? Why didn't they reach out when you were uncertain? Why did concern suddenly appear after you became stronger? Because the earlier version of you was easier for them to understand. You were still searching. You were still learning. You were still affected by other people's opinions. That version didn't challenge the structure around you. It made everyone comfortable. But you changed. Now imagine a chess game where one player suddenly stops reacting emotionally and begins thinking several moves ahead. Every attempt to pressure them becomes predictable. Every strategy becomes easier to recognize. That's what happens when someone develops discernment through experience. They weren't necessarily defeated in one dramatic moment, they were simply outgrown over time. And that realization can be more uncomfortable than losing an argument. The frightening part isn't realizing that you're behind. It's realizing that the entire situation has evolved while you were still using the old rules. They thought meetings created control. They believed discussion created safety. They assumed enough people agreeing on a strategy would somehow restore the old balance. But real progress doesn't always ask for consensus. It happens quietly. It develops privately. It becomes stronger while nobody is paying attention. And by the time everyone notices, it may already be established. That's what made the situation uncomfortable. There was no dramatic confrontation, no warning siren, no public announcement, just a quiet realization that the opportunity to redirect everything had already passed. And the most important part is this: you didn't have to attack anyone to reach that point. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to expose anyone. You didn't need to announce your next move. You simply continued. You remained consistent after the applause disappeared. You kept growing when encouragement became scarce. You learned during the seasons when nobody was validating your progress. While other people were focused on what could be seen above the surface, you were developing roots underneath it. Think about a tree. People see the branches and leaves first, but they don't see the years of root growth happening underground. By the time the tree becomes visible, moving, it is no longer simple. That's what quiet development looks like. And that's why the meeting didn't end with some dramatic victory speech. Sometimes realization doesn't create noise, it creates silence. The kind of silence that happens when people finally understand they are no longer ahead of the situation, they are watching it, they are observing what happens next. And silence doesn't always mean nothing is happening. Sometimes silence is the sound of influence changing direction. They left that room with a realization they couldn't easily escape. Whatever they once believed they could manage, redirect, or control had moved beyond their reach. The advice came late. The messenger came late. The concern appeared late. The fear finally arrived, but by then it couldn't change the timeline. And the most uncomfortable part for them, you didn't even have to be in the room. Your absence said enough. Your consistency had already spoken. Your transformation had already answered, and they were finally forced to listen. The shift never needed you to walk into the room. It happened because of the person you became when nobody was paying attention. You learned how to move without waiting for permission. You stopped depending on recognition. You stopped needing people to acknowledge your progress before you believed in it yourself. That meeting wasn't really about you anymore. It was about them realizing that the story you were writing no longer required their approval, their opinion, or their involvement. And once that truth finally settles in, there isn't much left for them to say. Number 3, you didn't transform where everyone could see you. You transformed where they had no access. They were watching the surface and completely missed what was changing underneath. They expected your growth to be obvious. They imagined dramatic announcements, emotional reactions, visible victories, or some major event they could point to and say, "That's when everything changed." But real transformation rarely works that way. You didn't necessarily become louder. You became deeper. You didn't need to look different on the outside because your internal operating system was being rebuilt. While they were measuring what you produced, you were changing how you handled pressure. While they were watching your reactions, You were releasing attachments. While they were studying your visible behavior, you were changing the beliefs and habits underneath it. They were observing the performance while the real transformation was happening somewhere they couldn't reach. Imagine someone watching a radar screen and believing they understand everything because they can. See the objects above them. They never think to look beneath the surface. They assume the loudest signal must represent the biggest change. But sometimes the most important transformation isn't louder. It's operating on an entirely different level. You didn't increase the volume. You changed the frequency. And once that happened, the old methods of reading you stopped working. They expected anger, but you developed restraint. They expected chaos, but you became organized. They expected disappointment to break you, but you became more stable. They expected emotional reactions, but you learned when silence was more powerful than an explanation. That's why they misread you. People who are accustomed to noise often mistake calmness for weakness. People who only understand force can interpret patience as surrender. Your stillness confused them because it didn't match their definition of power. They thought power meant being the loudest person in the room. You discovered that real power can mean being the person who controls their response. At some point, you may have wondered why certain people suddenly stopped understanding you. The answer is simple. They never learned how genuine transformation works. Real growth isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it is precise. It removes habits that no longer serve you. It changes what you tolerate. It improves your judgment. It makes you slower to react and faster to recognize patterns. From the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. Inside, everything is being rebuilt. The strongest upgrades rarely come with an announcement. You may have looked quieter to them, but you were becoming more focused. You may have appeared distant, but you were becoming less dependent. You may have seemed smaller in the room, but internally you were becoming harder to control. Think about a star collapsing inward. What looks like contraction can actually create extraordinary gravitational force. That's what your transformation resembled. Fewer words, less emotional noise, cleaner decisions, stronger boundaries, better timing. They couldn't explain why the new version of you felt different, but they could feel that something had changed. By the time they understood that you weren't falling apart, you were recalibrating, it was already difficult for them to predict your next move. And when predictability disappears, uncertainty takes its place. You didn't simply become someone new. You became someone they could no longer easily read. And that was the transformation they never prepared for. Number 4, you didn't simply walk away. You completely removed yourself from the game they were playing. They made the mistake of assuming they still had access to you. Your silence looked like obedience to them. Your calmness looked like agreement. Your lack of confrontation made them believe you were still operating under their rules. That was their mistake. While they were congratulating themselves for believing they still had influence, you were quietly disconnecting from the entire system. No dramatic announcement, no angry farewell, no final speech. Just a gradual and complete withdrawal from the patterns that once controlled your attention. They assumed you were still participating because you weren't fighting loudly. That's how shallow control works. It confuses silence with consent. It mistakes peace for surrender. It assumes that because someone isn't resisting publicly, they must still be trapped. But you had already left mentally. Imagine a chess player standing up from the table and walking away while the opponent continues, moving pieces, convinced the game is still happening. The board remains exactly where it was, but one player is no longer participating. That's what happened. You didn't flip the board. You didn't destroy the pieces. You simply stopped allowing their framework to define your choices. You stepped away from the approval cycle. You stopped chasing expectations. You stopped allowing rewards and punishments to determine your direction. You stopped needing permission to make decisions about your own life. And that's when things began changing in ways they couldn't easily explain. New opportunities appeared, different people entered your path, certain situations became easier. Doors that once seemed blocked suddenly looked less important because you had stopped standing in front of the same ones. That shift unsettled them because they couldn't categorize it. You weren't rebelling, so they couldn't easily call you difficult. You weren't failing, so they couldn't dismiss you. You weren't asking for their approval, so they couldn't use it as leverage. You had become an outcome they didn't know how to explain. Maybe you've wondered why life sometimes feels lighter after you finally detach from certain environments. It can be because you're no longer carrying expectations that were never meant to belong to you. You're no longer spending energy maintaining relationships, systems, or patterns that required you to remain smaller than you were becoming. Systems often resist change until they discover that resistance costs more than adaptation, and that's when the environment begins adjusting. When you leave a cage, the bars don't necessarily disappear. They simply stop defining your life. They noticed your departure later than they should have. Not when you stepped away, but when they saw that your progress continued without their permission. That's what truly surprised them. You didn't leave loudly. You left completely. And there is something deeply unsettling about a person who cannot be placed back into the position they once occupied. Number 5, he recognized the truth about you that they were trying not to admit. You didn't simply recover from what happened to you. You learned how to turn difficult experiences into strength. That is the part they struggle to understand. It may even explain why certain conversations become uncomfortable whenever your name comes up. Someone recognized that your story doesn't fit the ending they expected. They thought the setbacks would leave you bitter. They expected betrayal to make you permanently suspicious. They assumed disappointment would keep you trapped in the past. Instead, you processed it. Every betrayal taught you discernment. Every disappointment taught you patience. Every time someone walked away gave you another lesson about dependence. Every situation designed to weaken you became information you could use to make better decisions. You didn't need to make a public scene. You didn't need to announce your pain. You took what happened, learned from it, and continued. That's more difficult for certain people to understand than anger, because anger is predictable. They know how to respond to someone who is furious. They know how to defend themselves against someone demanding an apology. They know how to manipulate someone who desperately needs closure. But what happens when you no longer need any of that? Imagine two people experiencing the same intense heat. One spends their entire life trying to avoid it. The other learns how to use the heat to forge something stronger. That's the difference they failed to recognize. They thought pain would make you fragile. It made you precise. Some people heal simply because they want the pain to stop. Others use the experience to become wiser, more disciplined, and more intentional. They expected you to seek revenge. They waited for anger. They assumed you would demand explanations, apologies, or some final moment of closure. But you outgrew the need for those things. You didn't detach so they would feel guilty. You detached because you finally understood that your freedom mattered more than their understanding. At some point, you may have noticed something changing inside you. The anger that once pushed you forward stopped being necessary. Proving yourself stopped feeling satisfying. Even the idea of defeating the people who hurt you began to feel strangely small. That wasn't weakness, that was growth. That was the moment you realized you didn't need to keep fighting a battle simply because you had once been wounded by it. Indifference, when it comes from genuine healing, isn't weakness. It is closure without needing a ceremony. Anger keeps a person connected to what hurt them. Detachment breaks that connection. People can manipulate someone who desperately needs validation. They can threaten someone who is terrified of losing something. They can provoke someone who still needs to prove a point. But when you have made peace with uncertainty, rejection, and loss, those old emotional hooks become much weaker. You don't need revenge because your peace is more valuable. You don't need to prove them wrong because your progress is already speaking. And the person watching from the sidelines recognized that before everyone else did. He understood that you weren't carrying the wound anymore. You were carrying the lesson. You weren't just carrying the lessons from your past, you were carrying leverage. You learned how to turn difficult experiences into wisdom, and once you understand that, warnings lose much of their power. You're not constantly running away from what happened to you anymore. You're using what happened to become stronger, wiser, and harder to control. Number 6. You discovered the exit they hoped you would never find. The most powerful realization is understanding that participation was never mandatory. You don't have to keep playing a game that was never designed around your freedom. You don't need a dramatic rebellion or a public confrontation. Sometimes the strongest decision is simply choosing not to participate anymore. They built systems around approval, status, recognition, and permission, expecting everyone to keep chasing the same rewards. But you stopped chasing, and the moment you stopped needing their validation, their influence became weaker. Imagine a person leaving a casino while everyone else continues betting, convinced the next round will change everything. You didn't need to defeat the system, you simply stopped depending on it. That's real freedom. Their opinions may matter inside the environments they control, but they don't determine your value outside those walls. Once you understood that, you became difficult to influence. They can't punish someone who no longer reports to them. They can't reward someone who no longer asks for approval. They can't control someone who has already stepped away. And that is why your departure bothers them. When one person leaves a system and still succeeds, others may realize they can leave too. Freedom doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it begins with one quiet decision. You're no longer measuring yourself by their standards. You're not living according to their timeline. You're not negotiating your worth. You simply stopped standing in the arena they built for you. Number 7. They thought you were isolated, but you were building new connections. They assumed cutting you off would make you desperate to return. Instead, you used the distance to find people who valued character, alignment, and purpose more than titles or approval. While they were protecting old gates, you were discovering new doors. You connected with people who don't need permission to build. People who don't waste energy trying to impress systems they have already outgrown. People who recognize potential without demanding credentials first. Imagine someone disconnecting your old phone line while you have already moved to an entirely different network. They think they cut your communication, but they only disconnected you from a system you no longer needed. Real connections don't always announce themselves. They develop through shared values, experience, and mutual respect. That's why you may feel supported even when the support isn't obvious. You aren't necessarily surrounded by a crowd. You're connected to people who understand where you're going. They isolated you from their circle, not from your future. And that may be the part they never expected. You're not standing alone. You're simply standing in a place where their influence doesn't reach. Number 8. Nobody is coming to save you because you no longer need saving. Warnings are useful when someone is walking blindly toward danger. But what happens when someone is already walking away from the cage? They may still expect you to hesitate. They may wait for doubt to return. They may assume you'll eventually ask for permission or come back seeking approval. But you're not lost. You're becoming aligned. They mistake your silence for confusion. They interpret your calm as denial. They see your distance and assume you're avoiding something. But sometimes distance is simply clarity. You finally stopped moving according to what other people expected from you. And that is the outcome they never prepared for. Someone who can move forward without needing permission, applause, rescue, or approval. You don't need someone to come and save you. You needed to realize that you were already capable of walking out. You don't need a warning because you aren't walking toward danger anymore. You already passed through it. The approval, the rules, the timelines, and the constant need to be understood were never the destination. The real danger was staying where everyone else felt comfortable. They keep waiting for someone to stop you, but there is nothing left to stop. You already chose yourself, and the warning they wanted to give you was never really for you. It was for them, a quiet sign that their influence no longer reaches you. Number 9, they're still arguing inside the burning room while you're already outside. They're repeating the same ideas, defending the same rules, and convincing each other that nothing needs to change. Meanwhile, you've already moved forward. You don't need to convince them or rescue them. When a structure is collapsing, the people who recognize it early don't waste their lives debating. Inside it, they build somewhere else. You're not fueled by proving them wrong. You're fueled by momentum. You don't need their agreement to create, grow, or move forward. Leaving wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Number 10, no one tells a force of nature to stop. Nobody is warning you because there is nothing to correct. You're not moving recklessly. You're becoming more deliberate, more independent, and more focused. The people who understand this stage aren't trying to pull you back. They recognize it because they have experienced their own escape from limiting systems. You are no longer a problem they need to solve. You're becoming an example they quietly study. You went from being doubted to being respected, from being monitored to being referenced. You aren't a warning sign anymore. You're proof that choosing independence can lead to clarity. Number 11, they don't fear your failure. They fear your proof. Failure could have been used to justify everything they believed about you. But your success changes the story. You didn't need their permission. You didn't need their approval. You simply needed space. And once you had it, you started becoming everything they hoped you wouldn't become. Your success doesn't just show that you survived, it shows that the limits they placed around you were never absolute. You already lived without their approval and discovered that nothing essential was missing. They can't stop a journey that has already moved beyond their reach. Number 12, they finally realized you're out of range. The painful moment isn't rejection. It's realizing access is gone. They may try a message, a comment, or an old tactic, but nothing works the way it once did. Not because you're fighting them, but because you no longer depend on their reaction. No guilt works, no pressure works, no approval pulls you back. You're not blocked. You're simply unavailable to the old version of the relationship. You don't close the door dramatically, you outgrow the room. Number 13, your silence wasn't kindness. It was the conclusion. They thought your silence meant you were still thinking, still waiting, or still open to another conversation. But you weren't silent because you were confused. You were silent because there was nothing left to explain. Arguments would give them something to hold on to. Explanations would give them another opportunity to debate. Silence gives them nothing. You stopped trying to be understood because you finally realized that people who genuinely wanted to understand you already did. Your silence isn't weakness, it's a boundary. Number 14, too late was never about you. It was the diagnosis for them. Those two words weren't meant to scare you. They weren't rejection or arrogance, they were confirmation. They were late because they misunderstood you years ago. They thought pressure would break you. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought you would eventually return to the version of yourself they could understand. But you changed. By the time they wanted to warn you, the decision had already been made by your growth, your experience, and your consistency. You weren't approaching the danger. You had already passed it. That's why there is no need for revenge, no need for celebration, no need to prove anything. There is only clarity. The warning they wanted to give you was actually a warning for them. Their influence expired. And now you keep moving. No explanation, no looking back, just forward. If this message resonated with you, like the video, subscribe, and comment 777 to mark that you're staying the course. Share this message with someone who needs the reminder. This chapter is